Sevinc Turkon and a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Illinois, Urbana, with a specialization in translation studies, cross-cultural pedagogy, and certification in gender and women's studies. She is an assistant professor at Syracuse University, where she teaches courses in writing, translation, and creative nonfiction, and is a practicing literary translator across Bulgarian, Turkish, and German. Her notable works include perspectives on Orhan Pamuk and teaching translation. Her translation of the Stone Building and Other Places was a finalist for prestigious Pen Translation Award. She was named acting judge for the Pen Translation Award in 2021. She spoke about her multilingual background, journey into translations, teaching Orhan Pamuk, and the short story compilation The Stone Building and Other Places by eminent Turkish writer and activist Asla Ardavan. The book can be purchased using the link given in the show notes. Please share your feedback on this episode either on the Spotify app or through the link provided in the show notes. You can follow Harshaniyam podcast on Spotify, Apple, or search any of your favorite podcasting apps. Welcome to our podcast, Harshaniyam.
Oh, thank you for having me, Anil.
You know Turkish, Bulgarian, and German. What do you attribute your interest in languages to?
I was born in Bulgaria to parents. Bulgaria, Eastern Europe. It's kind of a country that nobody knows and talks about. I call it the Orient of Europe. I was born in Bulgaria to parents who identified themselves with Turkish ethnicity. Bulgaria at that time was under the communist regime, and the minorities were beginning to become the suspect as the communist regime was cracking in 1989, and we were sort of expelled from the country after the collapse of the communist regime, a little prior to that actually. So I grew up bilingual at home. My parents will speak Turkish to me, and the schooling was in Bulgarian. So I'm telling you this story because those of us who identify with multilingualism will have to admit that we don't have the time and energy that it requires to learn multiple languages. We begin bilingual most of the time, and that allows us to build on that. And so after age of 11, I grew up in Istanbul, in Turkey. This time at home, my parents will speak Bulgarian to me so that I don't forget. And schooling was in Turkish. I was admitted to the American college, which was a very multilingual environment, which sort of fed into my interest in languages and in travel. I then subsequently studied in Germany, in Munich and in Berlin, spent some time in England, and my first job was in Strasbourg. I was admitted to be a conference interpreter, simultaneous interpreter, and that environment was also full of highly educated multilingual people who encouraged me to pursue a graduate degree in comparative literature in the United States. So basically, the brief answer to your question is the context in which I grew up, the people that I was surrounded with were the motivating factor behind learning more languages and traveling.
Your PhD dissertation was about need for multiple translations.
As I said, I was admitted to complete a graduate degree in comparative literature. And that was an ideal home for me because before that, I really didn't fit or feel fitting anywhere in Bulgaria, I was identified as the Turk. My name, Sevinc, will give me away. I couldn't hide. In Turkey, even though my parents claimed Turkish ethnicity, I spoke the Turkish with an accent. I was the Bulgarian Turk. So that didn't work out very well. And so arriving at a department that was very multilingual, comparative literature, felt like home. There was no pressure to speak any language without an accent. So I was very happy. However, as I matured in my field, I came to recognize that comparatives were very snobbish. Translation was a bad word. We read text in the original. We wouldn't deign to be caught with a translation. If our research took us to a book that was written in a language that we didn't command, we would learn that language just to read the original. And so in this environment, I was very snobbish. I mean, it goes back to Edward Said's Orientalism, where Said taught us that translation is Orientalizing. Later, Eric Chaffetz, in his book, The Poetics of Translation, argued that translation is colonizing. Robert Young, in his monumental postcolonialism, talks about translation as empire. So this was the academic discourse in which I sort of matured. And so it was very intimidating to talk about translation. Although this discourse was very much against everything I experienced previously. I lived in the parts of the world where bilingualism was something that I encountered every day. Languages coexisted. And so I wanted to introduce this to my field. And that is where, when I proposed that I will research the German and English translations of modern Turkish literature. These were the languages in which with which I was working, and I was interested in how languages, literatures, cultures circulate beyond their original environment. I was very interested in what translators do or did. I was interested in the role of publishers, the gatekeepers of languages and cultures, and how all this is being received across national and linguistic borders. It was a subject that fascinated me and sort of motivated me to pursue it for years. And eventually, I guess, what I proposed, the sort of, I was responding to this environment in which the question was, how do we arrive at an adequate translation? Do we foreignize? Do we domesticate? What is the right path to pursue? And I was feeling very much the burden of that. I mean, in this environment, it was very difficult to become a translator. And so I suggested that multiple translations help us understand the original better. There's no one definite translation. And that sort of was my little gesture of extending my hand to translators to keep translating, but also it was my way of easing myself into translating. I never began as a literary translator. Even in those years when I was writing multiple languages and translating, I wouldn't call myself a translator. That came to me much later. I would say I translate. That was a safer space to occupy. And eventually, with the publication of The Stone Building, I felt more comfortable since people were referring to me as the translator. Then I became one. And so this was the journey of the PhD dissertation. That is, I arrived at translation through academic route, through the research route, studying translations, studying translators, interviewing translators, just like you do, and understanding what that is. And eventually I transitioned to the craft.
You wrote a book on teaching the works of Orhan Pamuk.
Back then, we were all very much interested in what Orhan Pamuk was producing. There was this prolific writer from Turkey doing magic with language, with themes, with images, with metaphors, bridging East and West. Obviously, he was very well read. You would read his novels and you will hear Proust and Dostoevsky and Kafka. And you'll be like, wow, there's this new kid on the block doing fabulous work with the Turkish language. And of course, eventually the Nobel Prize in Literature that he received catapult him on the world literary stage. He was very important. And at that time, I was working on modern Turkish literature, figuring out what kind of research I will pursue. I could not have ignored him. That wasn't an option, really. And it's so... and I was learning so much about his work, so much about what he was doing, so much about him as a person, as a writer. But I realized that I was pursuing an academic career and I didn't know how to teach his brilliant works to college students. And if you can't teach, you won't get a job in academia. You see where I'm going with this? Yes. And so I decided to work on a project that sort of inquires how to teach Pamuk in literature classes, in the courses on a specific genre, that was the novel, on the courses of world literature, East-West conversations, in the courses of modern Turkish literature and history, right? So many of us were studying and reading Pamuk, not knowing how to teach him. And I sent around a call for papers and I received a lot of proposals. At that time, I also need to mention the name of my co-editor, the brilliant scholar, David Damrosch from Harvard, who heard me talk about this project and he encouraged me to pursue a publisher. He introduced me to the Modern Language Association of America. We had a very interesting conversation between the editor, David, and myself, where the editor said, this is a brilliant idea, but Sevinc is also only a graduate student, and the editors of these volumes are seasoned writers and academics. So they were quite suspicious of my ability to accomplish that. And at that point, David said, okay, I will put my name next to hers, but she will do the job. She knows what she's doing. And I'm so grateful at that opportunity because really it was that long process of about 7 years that taught me so much about the world of publishing and scholarship as I was completing that project. The volume consists of about 20 chapters written by scholars across the globe and the nation, experts in Pamuk. And I framed my introduction to this volume, framed all these chapters with a discussion on what it means to teach Pamuk in translation. No matter what we were doing, whether we were literate in the Turkish, in the originals or not, we were all basing our arguments, assumptions, methodology on the English translations, on the translator's language. And so this is more or less the content and the framing of this text. By now, I think I talked with several colleagues about this volume across the United States, and it seems like it has become very popular among junior professors who are just beginning to teach, or graduate students who might not have access to the original, but they are interested in everything that Pamuk is doing as a writer. East-West relations, intertextuality, thematic concerns, genre concerns. And so this is where the approaches to teaching the works of Pamuk has become very handy. Another very nice thing that happened was that Pamuk wrote a little chapter for it, and it became the preface. And in that chapter he talks about himself as a teacher teaching his novels at Columbia University. It's a beautiful story that was just perfect to add as a preface. So that's the approaches to teaching Pamuk.
Orhan Pamuk wrote only in Turkish, right?
Exactly. All his works are, he has multiple translations from Victoria Holbrook to Güneli Gün to Erda to Maureen Freely. Yeah, he's not very faithful to his translators. And so what does this tell us? It tells us that Pamuk comes to us in English in multiple colors. It is impossible that these translators do not leave their own color, style, and tone in the translation. But Pamuk, even though his English is very good, I don't believe that he would be as good a writer in English. Because his subject matter, his inspiration, and so much part and parcel of the Turkish language, of the history of the Turkish language, and Istanbul, the city of Istanbul. So he's doing excellent job by staying in Turkish.
One more interesting project that you are involved is about teaching women writers about world literature. How did you conceive the program and how was the experience?
This was really the time around where I was working on the Stone Building and other places, the English translation of the Stone Building. It occurred to me that world literature has been dominated by male writers, including Pamuk. So I decided that it was high time to introduce a course that is exclusively on women writers across the globe, and to sort of discuss with my students, what are these women writing about? How are they writing? What matters to them? How do they relate to their male colleagues in their own linguistic and cultural and historical context, but also what does it take for them to arrive on the world literary stage? Why do they need the hand of somebody like me to be brought to my students' attention? So it was not just reading literature, it was reading literature framed by these linguistic, cultural, and political questions. And it very quickly became student favorite.
Please talk about contemporary Turkish literature.
What I say might apply to any literature, but is particularly acute to Turkish literature. Turkish literature's inception depends on the inception of the modern Turkish Republic in 1923. Of course, there is a lot to be said about what came before that day, but that day becomes sort of a trauma in the modern Turkish literature's subconscious, in that writers are constantly responding to historical, political formations that are taking place at home. Until I would say Pamuk. Pamuk is probably the name who was able to cross borders, become more vocal about the East-West relations and how they impact Turkish literature. So in the past 20 years, we have had Recep Tayyip Erdogan's government in Turkey. And of course, the literature has taken shape in that direction. Now we are talking about Islamic literature in Turkish. But there are also a lot of writers from Turkish ethnicity who grew up in Germany, who grew up overseas in Europe, who are now mixing Turkish and German, Turkish and English, Turkish and Arabic, and are producing multilingual or bilingual texts. not only the originals are very, very interesting and creative, but they also require the translator now to become even more creative. Another key theme or subject in Turkish literature, of course, is the Kurdish question. So the Kurdish question in Turkey has been a perennial problem. It goes back to the final years of the Ottoman Empire and the Kurdish citizens in the Ottoman Empire, the partitioning of the empire into various countries that we have today, and the spread of the Kurdish citizens across 3, 4, 5 current countries that we have, and a significant majority in Turkey. The Kurdish question has been mostly revolving around the issue of recognizing the Kurdish language, allowing Kurds to receive education in their own language, allowing them to voice their concerns, to participate in the government and in policy making. And yet, alas, the Turkish government has not handled this very well. It has mostly translated into conflict, into alienation, into hatred. There's always somebody to blame, and in Turkey, that has been the Kurdish citizens. But at the same time, as I was talking about multilingual writers, Turkish writers who grew up overseas and produce bilingual or multilingual texts as originals, now we have a lot of Kurdish writers writing in Turkish and incorporating the Kurdish history, Kurdish concerns, and the Kurdish language into their writing. Now, how do you translate this? How do you translate this into English? I mean, I will, since I've been working on a text with Kurdish accent in it, I've been thinking about and conversing with my colleagues, translator colleagues, regarding how to handle this. And so there's no simple translation into English. No way. But if I can find a way to connect this conflict or challenge that Turkey is having, the Turkish language is having, sort of being pressed to recognize its Kurdish sibling. Now, in English, I'm looking at the African American dialects and how those accents can sort of travel into my translation, and I can benefit from that. Obviously, there's a lot of ethical issues that I have to think about as I'm doing this. And yet the translation is in its very early stage. And so I'm just sharing with you sort of insights into the process of translation. And before that process becomes this beautiful, shiny product that the book is. Mm-hmm.
Before we get onto the book, The Stone Building, can you please talk about the current socio-political situation in Turkey?
That is a bleeding wound in my body. I've been away from Istanbul for about 19 years now. Even though I go back home every year, every summer, I spend time with my parents in Istanbul. And every year I return to Istanbul, I see a different city. Quite of a transformation. The current government has been around for about 20 years. It is a very sad story. When I grew up in 1980s and 90s in Istanbul, it was a very, very different Istanbul. And this current government sort of changed the face of the country in a way that will take years and decades to lift. Whether even I'm not even sure that that is an option anymore. But Mr. Erdogan, when he became a president, when he was elected, he arrived on that political stage with a lot of hope. From across the country. We were all supporting him in his body. We were seeing West and Islam coexisting, and yet he proved that he was not the one to accomplish that dire task. things didn't go very well. Initially, he was supporting Turkey's acceptance to the European Union, but he was supporting that for reasons other than what we wanted. For him, the military was the problem, and he wanted to sideline that military that would prevent him to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. And for him, European Union was an option, right? The European Union also wasn't happy with the constant military coups that were taking place in Turkey. And the way to go around this was to revise the constitution. And the way to go about this for Mr. Erdogan was to sideline the old military, to force them into retirement, and to replace that military with people who were sympathetic to his cause. Isn't it ironic that even that military that he installed revolted against him in July of 2016, which was behind the failed military coup? So you see, on the one hand, the political mentality consolidating around politics and the military in Turkey, but at the same time, you see the rift that is occurring even within that consolidation. And right now we have one-man rule. There is absolutely no talk about democracy. Democracy in Turkey has never been liberal democracy. It was a democracy, but it was kind of illiberal, and there were always people who were not part of that democracy. Today, it is impossible to talk about democracy. And it's a sad story to be seen. It's also very interesting. I think it is a good time and place to be for Turks, so that we can see what we are made of, so that we can see what it is that we can do, whether we will continue to quietly accept this, or whether it is high time to do something about it.
Now, please introduce the book, The Stone Building and Other Places, and talk about the author too.
So, The Stone Building and Other Places, the Turkish Taş Bina ve Diğerleri, was published in 2009 in Istanbul. So, quite a time ago. And the translation, The Stone Building and Other Places, was published 10 years after that in 2018, 2019. So there's about a 10-year gap. So, of course, I studied modern Turkish literature for a while, and I was very aware of the prolific writer that Aslı Erdoğan is. Of course, she was in my purview as I was teaching women writers in world literature. She was in my purview as I was studying modern Turkish literature and the contemporary writers. But for a very long time, translating that book was not on my mind at all. Only in 2016, that year will repeat across our conversation today, is when I myself was going through a difficult time, crossroads, career anxieties, and I needed to do a work that was challenging for me, that was sort of occupying my mind and preventing my mind from drifting all over the place. And The Stone Building did that job for me. I reread that summer, I reread the Turkish, and I realized that I'm still not getting it. And the only way to get it was to translate it. Alas, the very same year, in July of 2016, the failed military coup took place in Turkey. That was a milestone for all of us watching the political establishment in the country. In July of 2016, there were a series of bombings at the airport, Atatürk Airport in Istanbul. My parents live about 10-15 minutes away from that airport. We actually had a family member at the airport at that time. Thankfully, nothing happened, but it was a difficult year. And so that summer, I was religiously translating. I would spend about 8 hours every day. And I have to admit that if I manage going through a paragraph or translating a paragraph a day, that was a successful day. The stone building is not an easy text. Aslı Erdoğan is not an easy writer. I would place her in the group of existentialist writers. She's not a novelist in the traditional sense. She's not even a storyteller. I would say the most important character in her novels or in her books is language. It is these metaphors and these striking images that she creates with the Turkish language. One scholar actually called them a crossfire of images. There are all these voices that come in and out. There's this chorus that always fails at the end. Darkness speaks louder than light. That is Aslı Erdoğan, and that is the stone building. The stone building consists of 3 short stories and a longer novella, the stone building, attached at the end of the book. The initial reception of the book in Turkey was lukewarm. I mean, she was writing at a time when the literary establishment was still dominated by male writers. It's difficult, not to mention the sort of humongous Orhan Pamuk. Everybody else is in his shadow and she's in the shadows of others. But still, she was very prolific. She was writing. I think she's brilliant. She's so good. But at the same time, very challenging. And I guess that was the challenge that was motivating me to pursue the translation. By August of 2016, I did have something that I was comfortable calling a first draft. I was hiding it, of course, in the drawer of my desk. I wasn't ready to share it with anybody other than intimate, close friends and colleagues. And also, August 2016 is when she was arrested and imprisoned. I was sitting in my office reading news from Turkey, and there is the headline. Now, what do? I realized that what I was doing was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. I was sitting in my office, leisurely enjoying the process of translating. I had a first draft. It wasn't ready to be published, but I was pressed to talk about this woman who was imprisoned in Turkey, a brilliant writer, imprisoned for completely unjust reasons. She was writing for a pro-Kurdish newspaper. She was imprisoned under the pretext that she was the literary advisor of an opposition newspaper. All she was doing is writing columns to earn some money on the side. Yes, she was very critical of the government, of the human rights abuses in Turkey. And that, of course, bothered the government. Why else would they be threatened by a woman whose books they weren't even reading? And if they read, they wouldn't be able to understand. And she was in prison, and they were asking for 16 years in prison. That was not a joke. Yes. So this was the time where I began writing to Human Rights Watch, PEN America, human rights organizations, literary awards committees, talking about this woman, talking about her craft. I was reaching out to publishers, inquiring about their interest in publishing this translation. Honestly, Anil, there was absolutely no interest. Nobody knew who Aslı Erdoğan was. Nobody knew who Sevinc Turkon was. Obviously, I wasn't anything back then. And as you know, publishers pursue profit. That is their primary reason for existence. And unless something is promising, they would not go in that direction. And of course, I wasn't working with a writer like Orhan Pamuk. There was also Erdogan. She by now she has about 10, 12 books, and only one of her novels was available in English. Um, Luckily, though, City Lights from San Francisco showed interest, and I was thrilled. I could not have imagined a better publisher than City Lights. Why? Because their history goes back to the Beat generation in the States, Ferlinghetti. They have published a long list of Noam Chomsky. They are very important when it comes to surrealism. Antonin Artaud, Batelier are household names in their catalog, and the Stone Building. What an honor. Perfect. Ideal. And it wasn't even my choice. I just reached out to them, submitted an inquiry letter, and there it is. They showed interest. And so this is how this really gave birth to the translation. If I managed to complete the first draft of the translation in 3 months, in working on it religiously every day in 3 months, it took me about 8 months to revise that translation and really to bring it to the stage in which it exists now and circulates. And eventually in 2019, the Stone Building became a finalist for the prestigious PEN Translation Award. What an honor. What an honor for me, something that I would not have dreamt, seen in my wildest dreams, right? English is my third language, depending on how you count. And so now that the book is out there, the translation circulates, I receive invitations to talk about it. And it seems there is this one question that persists. A brilliant question that I never thought about before. How does it feel to translate into a non-native tongue? Um, and I'm so grateful for that question because honestly, when I was translating, I never thought about it. It wasn't an issue at all. I was translating because I was motivated to translate. And now that I think about it, translating into Turkish or Bulgarian, one of my mother tongues, wouldn't have been easier at all. Translation is never easy, right? It is the commitment that redeems it. And I think at that time, being so committed to the text, being so committed to this writer, being committed to the craft of translating was what was redeeming all that. And that really brings us back to the issue of mother tongue, that sort of a phrase that I could never understand, or adjective. Why mother tongue? Um, Mom, if you're listening to this has nothing to do with you. I love you. But in my case, linguistic belonging wasn't an option. I wasn't at home in Bulgarian. I wasn't at home in Turkish, even though these were my native languages, even though these were mother tongues. And I guess I found the mother in the English language. Something that I think is important to think about. That is, the language doesn't determine the direction of the translation.
Now, is it because you could read a lot of great literature in English?
Of course, Anil, that has to do with it, right? My professional identity is formed by English, by world literary writers, writers that I admired and emulated and pursued.
Now, we will talk about a couple of stories. The first one is Prisoners. It is an out and out stream of consciousness story. It gets very surreal, dreamy. How difficult was it for you to maintain that monotone in that story, word by word, sentence by sentence?
Anil, thank you for reading it. Aslı Erdoğan is not an easy read. Um, and yet she's so insightful, she's so penetrating. You can't forget those images. You can't forget that bizarre dream that the prisoner sort of narrates towards the end of the story, which I'm hoping that I will read for you at the end. But what were the challenges of translating this? I mean, obviously the images, and no image in any language will literally translate into another language. You have to find images in the translating language to substitute, to put them to work for you. And oftentimes we sort of hear the talk about translation is most often associated with what is lost in translation. Well, how about what is gained in translation? I think that is very important as well. Unless you have the translation, the original is barren. The brilliant Benjamin, Walter Benjamin talks about translations as the afterlife of the original. You don't have an afterlife unless you have a translation. So what a gain. And yes, there are a lot of problematic translations out there, but I do believe we have to begin somewhere. And if we understand that no translation is perfect, every translation invites more translations, then we are safe. Every translation, I talk about the stone building as being a timely translation in the sense that it responded to a very specific time and place and urgency. And I welcome more translations because the original is so rich. My translation could never match up to that. And I didn't even try because that is a failure to begin with. My purpose was something else. My purpose was to make this writer available to wider readership, help her gain literary awards, which she did. Not only my little translation gained the Penn Translation Award, but think about award committees that convene to judge a writer's craft. These committee members might read French. One of them might read Turkish. One of them might read Russian or Italian, Greek or Spanish. But English is the common denominator. And that is exactly what happened in this case. And I'm so glad. Although I think the prominence that Aslı Erdoğan received with the publication of The Stone Building and a lot of activist work, and as you hear me talk, I'm not only talking about a translator, but I am talking about somebody who contracts and contacts on her behalf, like the agent, the work of the agent, writing to literary award committees. After 4 months in prison, she was released because here's this writer receiving all these awards in Europe, and yet in Turkey, she's in prison. That didn't fare very well on the government. They released her from prison, but then they put a hold on her passport. And one of the first award ceremonies was in Amsterdam. It was the European Cultural Foundation Princess Margaret Award for Culture, which Aslı Erdoğan received. She could not travel to the award ceremony. I attended on her behalf. It was this very bizarre moment. In the middle of this ceremony, thankfully, the award committee traveled to Istanbul and they interviewed her, and they created a little documentary that they projected on the big screen during this ceremony. But think about it, Anil. You have this brilliant writer who can't even attend her award ceremony.
One of the best endings that I read in a short story is from the story called The Wooden Birds.
Yes, the wooden birds, the story alone received some awards in Europe before it became part of the. So it's a acclaimed story. I am with you. It is beautiful in its sadness. Think about it. These women hospitalized in a pulmonary hospital. They're isolated. We talk about prison. We talk about incarceration, confinement. And they have a day off from this hospital where actually they can step out, and what they do is they go down or up a gorge to get a glimpse of these men rowing in the water. Ah, it is sad. It is beautifully said. Right. And not only that, I remember you told me that you heard Chekhov in the story to the duel, and sort of made me think about the importance of intertextuality in literature, right? Writers write about their experience, but they write more about other books. And in recognizing intertextuality is the joy of the reader. We love that. We read and we are like, there is Chekhov, there is Proust, there is Dostoevsky, there is Kafka. How do you translate this? Aslı, the stone building is a very Kafkaesque text. And here I will connect it to the challenges that comes with translation. Oftentimes I ask questions about when you were translating. I receive questions about when you were translating, were you in contact with the writer? Could you ask her questions? No, she was in prison. She had more important things to worry about than one word that I couldn't figure out in the original. However, it occurred to me that, especially in the revision process, it is way more important to have readers who don't know the original, who can look at your translation and tell you whether that still reads Turkish or is a text that can stand on its own. Because I was so deeply buried in the original, I couldn't let the original go. But that was actually working against me. And so when I was revising, I was like, how about I read a little Kafka? Because the text is so Kafkaesque. It can actually help me figure out some of the challenges and even troubles in the original. I could have read Kafka in German. But would that help me? No. I was reading English translations of Kafka, and there are some brilliant ones, and there are multiple ones. And so I was into the translator's language. How did she translate these Kafka images? And I was actually borrowing language from English translations of Kafka to translate the stone building. And it was so joyful when Ron Slade, the brilliant writer Ron Slade, reviewed the stone building. And he was talking about the Kafkaesque undertones in the stone building. That is the ultimate compliment, right? To have an English writer, an American writer, feel the Kafkaesque undertones in the original.
Now, please pick up one of the stories from the book and read a paragraph or two in both English and in Turkish.
The first couple of paragraphs from the stone building, which is the novella, the collection called The Stone Building and Other Places. The facts are obvious, contradictory, coarse, and blaring. I leave the facts like a mound of giant stones to those who busy themselves with important matters. What interests me is the murmur among them, indistinct, obsessive. Digging through the rock pile of facts, I'm after a handful of truths, or what used to be called that. These days, it doesn't have a name. Lured on by a flickering light, what if I were to dive deeper and deeper? If I could reach the bottom and make it back, I'm after a handful of sand, the song of the sand that slips through my fingers and disappears. Those who speak of the shadow speak the truth. Truth speaks through shadows. Today, I will speak of the stone building, the one that the narrative has avoided at all costs, or at least kept at a safe distance, looking out at it from behind words. Constructed long before I was born, it's 5 stories tall if we don't count the basement, and there are steps leading up to the entrance. One must write with the body, with the naked, defenseless body beneath the skin. Yet, words only call out to other words. You take the letter L and F, a couple of vowels, I and E, and you write life. The only key is not to confuse the order. Misplace a letter, and you turn the living clay into simple inert matter. As the legend goes, like in the legend, life as I write it belongs to those who can grab it with a deep sigh, not with a mere breath, like plucking a fruit from its branch, a root from the earth. As for you, what's left is but an echo, like the hum of waves that you hear when you hold an empty shell to your ear. Life, a word imbibed and consumed down to its very marrow. The hum of a wave of quiet grief, an ocean full of waves. Okay, and now this is the corresponding passage from the Turkish. Olgular açık, uyumsuz, kaba, yüksek sesle konuşmaya hevesli. Dev taşlar gibi yığılmış olguları önemli şeylerle ilgilenenlere bırakıyorum. Beni çeken yalnızca aralarındaki mırıldanma, belli belirsiz, saplantılı. Kayalar dolusu olguyu eşeleyerek elde edebileceğim bir avuç hakikatin ya da eskiden öyle denirdi, şimdi ise bir adı yok peşindeyim. Bir ışıltının ardından derinlere, en derinlere dalıp diplere ulaşır da geriye dönmeyi başarırsam, parmaklarımın arasından kayıp gidecek bir avuç kumların ezgisinin peşindeyim. Gerçeği söylemiş olur gölgeden söz eden. Hakikat gölgelerle konuşur. Bugün taş binadan, yazının köşe bucak kaçtığı ya da güvenli bir mesafede durup sözcüklerin arkasından baktığı taş binadan söz edeceğim. Benim doğumumdan çok önce inşa edilmiş, bodrumu saymazsak 5 katlı, girişinde basamaklar var. İnsan bedeniyle yazmalı, tenin altındaki çıplak, savunmasız bedenle. Oysa sözcükler yalnızca başka sözcüklere seslenir. Bir H harfi alırsın. 2 tane A, Y ve T, hayat diye yazarsın. Tek sır harflerin yerini şaşırmamak. Efsanedeki gibi bir harfi düşürüp canlanan çamuru saf ölüme çevirmemek. Hayat diye yazıyorum. Bir soluktan çok derin bir iç çekmeyle onu kaparıp alabilenlerin. Dalından bir meyveyi, topraktan bir kökü koparırcasına. Sana kalansa boş bir kabuğa kulağını dayadığında duyduğun uğultu. Hayat, iliğine kemiğine dek emilmiş bir sözcük, iç sızıntısını andıran bir uğultu, okyanuslar dolusu uğultu.
So, thank you, Sevinc, for your time and for patiently answering all the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anil. You created a comfort that I needed to talk about this. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.